American history taught us about the massacre at the Alamo and about Custer's last stand, but they taught us nothing about the battle where hundreds of black soldiers were slaughtered. Just what was this battle where over 200 black men were killed without quarter? The massacre of Fort Pillow. In the spring of 1864, the Civil War was entering its third brutal year. Union victories were mounting, and with them came a new army. Men who had once been enslaved, now wearing the blue uniform of the United States. To the Confederacy, the sight of armed black soldiers was intolerable, a living, breathing rejection of everything the South believed in. Nowhere did that hatred erupt more savagely than at Fort Pillow, Tennessee. There, on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River, the men of the 6th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery and the 2nd U.S. Colored Light Artillery stood shoulder to shoulder with white Unionists from Tennessee. Many of these black men had been enslaved only months earlier. Now, they carried rifles and the dignity of their own freedom. The Confederates who surrounded them understood exactly what that meant. Led by Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, a man who would later become the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, they saw this not as a battle, but as a rebellion of race. And Forrest's response would become one of the darkest chapters in American military history. On the morning of April 12, 1864, Forrest's cavalry encircled Fort Pillow. They outnumbered the Union forces by almost 3-1. By afternoon, they had overrun its defenses. What happened next was not combat, it was butchery. Confederate soldiers shouted, "No quarter! Kill the damned niggers!" and opened fire on men who had already thrown down their weapons. Black soldiers were shot in the back as they ran toward the river. Others were bayoneted where they fell. Some were burned alive when tents caught fire. Even the wounded, pleading for mercy, were executed where they lay. White soldiers who surrendered were spared. Black soldiers who surrendered were slaughtered. By the time the smoke cleared, Fort Pillow was a field of corpses. Of roughly 600 Union soldiers, more than half were dead. Only about 1/3 of the white troops were killed. But nearly 70% of the black soldiers were massacred. Forrest's goal was not simply to take a fort. It was to send a message that for a black man, the price of fighting for freedom would be death without mercy. Witnesses described the slaughter in horrifying detail. Bodies lined the riverbank. Black soldiers were shot after surrendering, bayoneted in the face, and left to bleed beside the men who had once enslaved them. It was not war. It was extermination, a war crime born of white supremacy. When Congress investigated the massacre, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War called it exactly what it was: a deliberate, barbarous, and inhuman massacre. The North was outraged. Black enlistment surged. Across Union camps, soldiers began to chant, "Remember Fort Pillow." Those 3 words became both battle cry and warning, a promise that the dead would not be forgotten. In the white South, however, Forrest became a hero, celebrated as the man who stopped a black uprising. After the war, he carried that same legacy of terror into the founding of the Ku Klux Klan. Fort Pillow proved that the Civil War was never just about territory or states' rights. It was a fight for the very idea of black humanity. On that blood-soaked Mississippi bluff, the Confederacy revealed its true face. Slavery's violence did not end with emancipation. It lived on in the smoke of Fort Pillow, and later in the burning crosses and hoods of the night riders, who followed the same creed by other means, where surrender meant nothing and freedom was punished by death. 250 people were lost at the Alamo. 270 people were lost with Custer at his last stand. Over 300 were lost at Fort Pillow. Of the dead, the overwhelming majority, over 70%, were black. Why was this not taught in American history? To learn more, read Dixieland, Tales, Stories, and Anecdotes of Unfiltered Black American History.